So Russia has invaded Ukraine. Let's talk about the political implications of this crisis here in the United States, in Ukraine, and in Russia. Let's talk about it now. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to give you the ammunition you need to be able to fight for your values against the MAGA crowd. So when we talk about true authoritarian states in the world, right now, it's hard not to think of Russia and China. Those two countries have made common cause with trying to control everything in the economy, as well as people's lives. In fact, I would say that the nightmare of most Americans is for the United States to turn into something like what they have in either China or Russia. Well, as it turns out, that's also the nightmare of the people of Ukraine. For those of you who need a quick primer on Ukraine, Ukraine is basically a large country in southeastern Europe. It basically borders Russia to the east, Belarus to the north, Poland to the northwest, Hungary to the west, and Romania to the southwest. Now, Ukraine is actually a surprisingly large country and a surprisingly wealthy country in terms of natural resources. In fact, it's often been referred to as the breadbasket for the Soviet Union when it was part of the Soviet Union. Much of the wheat that is grown here in the United States actually comes from a strain that was originally grown in Ukraine. Now, I'm quite familiar with the people of Ukraine, given the fact that my kids actually, for a period, went to a Ukrainian school here in Michigan. I can tell you, based upon my experiences, that the Ukrainian people are a proud people. There are people who want democracy, and there are people who do not want to be dominated by Russia. And here's the irony, which is that there's actually a large percentage of Ukrainians who actually are of Russian descent. A good portion of Ukraine actually speaks Russian, which is part of the argument that Vladimir Putin has made as to why Ukraine should be part of the greater Russia that he's trying to recreate. If you had asked Ukrainians, you'd actually have found that they were relatively split as to whether they wanted closer relations with Russia or closer relations with the West. Well, that's all changed thanks to Vladimir Putin. If anything has happened as a result of this invasion, the Ukrainians have been pushed almost universally against Russia. And so that leads us to the first political result of this invasion, which is that Ukraine, given the opportunity, is going to move farther away from Russia rather than closer to it. The only way that Ukraine's going to remain close to Russia is by force. And that's exactly what Putin is trying to do. Here in America, it's easy for us not to acknowledge the fact that this is a full-scale war that's going on, an actual invasion. Check out this map here that the New York Times printed that shows all the places across the country where the war was occurring just on the first day. You can see Russian forces coming in from the east, from the northeast, and from the north. You can see where they took the area after a violent battle surrounding the old nuclear reactor at Chernobyl. You can see where they're rushing south toward the city of Kiev, the capital city in Ukraine. And you can see where they landed at the southern shores of Ukraine on the Black Sea. This is a full-scale invasion where already at least 50 Ukrainian troops have been killed, and the expectation there may be as many as 50,000 civilian casualties as a result of this. This is not something that we can just kind of push off to the side. Now, this brings me to the second political implication of this invasion, which is the implications here in the United States. On the one hand, as I've stated in a number of videos, President Biden stands to actually gain support as a result of his strong stance and his real leadership on this issue. Biden has been very consistent in his position on this. Number one, that American troops would not be put in harm's way as a result of this invasion. And number two, that we, the United States, would lead a coalition of Western nations imposing strong sanctions against Russia, the kind of sanctions that will cause serious harm against Russia, its leadership, and the country as a whole. The kind of things that will weaken Putin's regime throughout the country, something I'll get to in a minute when we talk about the political implications in Russia. As Americans, we tend to rally behind our leader in times of international crisis, and this could be an opportunity for Biden to show, as he's been showing, what we can get when we have a strong leader taking a strong stance on foreign policy. Now, the irony is that on the Republican side, the Republicans don't really know what to do about this whole situation. There are basically three reactions that we're seeing among Republicans. The most outrageous is the one coming out of Donald Trump and his former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who are basically praising Putin, calling him a genius. That's a direct quote. And essentially echoing the talking points that the Russian leader is using as his propaganda within Russia to justify the invasion. The second position that we're seeing Republicans taking is that Ukraine really isn't important to the United States. Why are we worried about that? And I have three answers to that. The first one is the Ukraine, as I pointed out earlier, is a substantial country, a large country in Europe with substantial natural resources, substantial farming resources. It's a major contributor to the energy economy of the world and the food economy of the world. And it's a source of many metals, all of which you'll see the prices go up as a result of this invasion. The second response I have to that is that none of that should matter. This is a global crime. This is an invasion by a big neighbor against a smaller country with no justification. This would be the equivalent of the United States literally walking in and taking over Mexico. Vladimir Putin has done everything he can to try to goad the Ukrainians into doing something, make some mistake that would give him a justification for this invasion. And to give the president of Ukraine credit, Volodymyr Zelensky, and I don't know if I said that correctly, but the president of Ukraine has actually been very savvy in avoiding giving the Soviets. That is a Freudian slip if ever there was one, because essentially what Putin wants to do is recreate the Soviet Union. But at any rate, Zelensky has done everything he can to avoid giving the Russians any kind of pretext for their invasion. It's clear, based upon what's going on, that Putin is the bad guy and the Russians are going into this war without justification, essentially invading a peaceful neighbor who has done nothing to offend them other than trying to go their own way. The irony is that Ukraine wants to be a democracy, and this is actually part of why Putin and the Belarusian leader to the north, who's a big supporter of Putin's, are so offended by the Ukrainians. In their last election, they elected a leader who was not a politician. In fact, he was a comedian. An actor who played the president of Ukraine on television, if you can believe it. Much of the commentary has been focused that in this type of a crisis, he's kind of in over his head. And, there's probably some basis to that. But you got to give the guy credit. He's performed under the kind of pressure that again, I'm making that mistake again, that the Russians have been putting him under. The bottom line is, if we're going to stand by and allow a large country to invade a smaller country just because they feel like it, there's going to be no stopping this kind of aggression around the world. We can expect that China will invade Taiwan, expecting that there will be no repercussions the way it was against the Russians. And likely this will just be the start of the conquests of the Russians, probably that we'll see more in Central Asia, and we might even see the Chinese pushing south. At a certain point here, we need to decide if the United States is on the side of a global order that respects the autonomy of countries, or if we believe in a global order where basically the powerful can do whatever they want and bully their neighbors. To me, if the United States takes this position, it would be turning our backs on the legacy that was provided when we justifiably defended the entire world against the aggression of the Japanese and the Germans in World War II. During that war, 400,000 Americans died, fighting for democracy and for the rule of law and for countries to have their own territorial integrity. We would literally be turning our backs on all those who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country and for the world if we didn't stand up for that belief. Finally, the third answer I have to those people is shut up, because a lot of these same people who are claiming that we have no business in Ukraine and no concern over it are the same people who are supporting our invasion of Iraq. That, similarly, under George W. Bush, was an unjustified invasion. Prior to the invasion, Iraq made it clear that they would allow weapons inspectors into the country to ensure that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and weapons of mass destruction were never found, even after we had taken over the country. And finally, it's been shown repeatedly that they had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda and nothing to do with 9/11. So anyone who's claiming that we have no business worrying about Ukraine when you were in favor of an invasion in Iraq, well, shut up. The third response that we're hearing from Republicans is that somehow Biden wasn't strong enough. Well, they don't offer anything, though, that he could have done differently. The only thing that we could offer that's stronger than what Biden has done is to actually start getting involved in fighting the war. Is that what Americans really want right now? I would say no. I think Americans have made it very clear we do not want to be involved in any more foreign wars. So the position that President Biden has taken that, number one, we will not send American troops into harm's way, but number two, that we will lead a coalition of freedom-loving countries around the world in asserting strong sanctions against Russia is about the strongest position that anybody could take legitimately. So anybody who says, oh, Biden could have been stronger, well, you know what? I'd like to see what you think he should be doing differently. So I think in the United States, politically, this stands to be an opportunity that benefits the Democrats and sows division among the Republicans, even showing how little they care about democracy and the rule of law around the world. Finally, the question is, what about in Russia? What are the political implications there? And you might say that Putin doesn't care because he's an authoritarian leader. But that's not the way authoritarian governments work. They still do need to maintain some level of support among the populace, because if they don't, then they lose legitimacy and they end up being pushed out by a popular uprising, essentially. That's very much what we're seeing happening in Myanmar right now, for example, and what we saw happen in many of the Eastern Bloc countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. As we know, Ukraine, which was once part of the Soviet Union, wants to be a democratic republic with close relations to the United States. And other countries which were once part of the Warsaw Pact, countries like Poland and Hungary, for example, are now part of NATO, which used to be the sworn enemy of the Warsaw Pact. That's part of what's driving Vladimir Putin crazy. But to me, there are two issues motivating Vladimir Putin here. Number one, and this has been widely cited, in fact, Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, wrote an editorial where she talked about the fact that when she met Putin, it was clear that he felt a deep embarrassment for the fact that his country had fallen from being this great Soviet Union, one of the two superpowers in the world, into being really, let's face it, a third-rate country with an economy smaller in size than that of Texas, if you can believe it. Putin watched as these countries that were once dominated by the Soviet Union, and then even parts of the Soviet Union itself, drifted away from Russia and went their own way, like Ukraine. Putin feels a very deep sense of loss on that, and that really bothers him, and he's embarrassed by it. And so part of his goal as president has been essentially to recreate the power of the Soviet Union and to put this country back in the position it was before the fall of the Berlin Wall. The second reason that I would say Putin is engaging in this gambit is because he's starting to deal with some political issues of his own within the country. Again, he needs to retain his own legitimacy within the country. As in the United States, something that motivates Russians, generally speaking, to come together and support their leader is some type of foreign threat. And so Vladimir Putin, by invading, he's engaging in kind of like that movie Wag the Dog, where he's able to create a foreign crisis that he leads Russia out of, thus solidifying his support. Well, interestingly enough, Vladimir Putin does not have that great support within Russia for this invasion. Again, this is an authoritarian country where people live in fear for their lives if they disagree with the government. And yet we've seen massive protests across Russia with hundreds of thousands of people demanding that Russia not engage in this war of choice. And even within the Kremlin itself, the people who support Vladimir Putin, there's a lot of discomfort with the idea that Vladimir Putin is going on this war of conquest, which will result in the loss, frankly, of much wealth to the Soviet Union. Again, I'm saying it again, much loss of wealth to Russia. You have to remember, Putin is supported by oligarchs who gain their power essentially as a result of the wealth they've accumulated by taking over industries that were once operated by the communist government. What's more is Russia gains a lot of its wealth from the export of oil and gas. In fact, it's the world's largest gas exporter, if you can believe it. So the fact that there are going to be these sanctions that will go after the wealth of many of these wealthy supporters of Putin's is something that they are not in favor of. Finally, the sanctions that the United States and our allies are threatening and imposing against Russia are significant. Really, it's quite surprising how strong all of our allies have been. Let's point to Germany, for example. Germany relies upon Russia for much of its natural gas. Much of that natural gas comes to Germany through pipelines that run through Ukraine. For the past few years, Russia has been building a new pipeline through the North Sea to Germany called the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And the greatest wish of Putin and his energy-wealthy plutocrats has been to create this direct link where gas from Russia can go into Germany. Well, Germany has stopped construction on this pipeline, despite the fact that it's going to impact the price of gas within their own country. That's a significant sacrifice that they're making, and one that, frankly, nobody expected them to make, especially given the fact that you've got a new leader in Germany, and you no longer have someone with the strength of Angela Merkel, who would be willing to stand up to the likes of Vladimir Putin. These sanctions will hit very hard at the Russian economy and stand to create such hardship among the Russians that it will erode support for Putin's government. Well, this is certainly a crazy time, and there's just a lot of unpredictability surrounding this situation. And ironically, it's happening at a time when there's so much that's already unpredictable with the coronavirus and with inflation and so many other issues that President Biden is dealing with. But I think there's good cause for optimism that this crisis could end up being an opportunity for the good guys, not just here in the United States, but also in Ukraine and in Russia. Well, if you like this video, why don't you check out this other video that I did where I talk about some of Biden's masterful political moves and how he's shown that he's really a very capable leader and someone who Democrats should be proud to support. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.